Now we're going to have a look at what namespaces actually are. Namespaces, as the name suggests, is a space with a specific name. Try to imagine a scenario. We have our SSD library and we have Zend library. And try to imagine that we have two files inside of both of these libraries called helper. So simply we would have object equals new helper. And now system wouldn't really know which helper we're referring to because they obviously want two different ones. One is in SSD folder, the other one is inside of the Zend folder. The way to distinguish between the two is to use the namespace. This is why we moved all of our system files into a separate folder inside of the library directory. So now what we can do is use the use keyword and then SSD / and helper. And by doing this, we are telling the system that we want to use the helper from within the SSD namespace. In order to make the helper belong to the SSD namespace, what we need to do, and we're going to do with this autoloader as well, because autoloader also belongs to the SSD namespace, we need to define it at the top of our class file. So namespace SSD. And now whenever we are using, in this case it will be use SSD autoloader. Whenever we use SSD autoloader, system knows that we are referring actually to this autoloader within the SSD space. Now it's all fun, but if we have use Zend helper, what happens then? We are referring to the helper. Now, which helper are we referring to? Because we're using both of them within the same file. In order to overcome this problem, we can also define them as something else. Let's say SSD helper. And now we can refer to this specific helper as new SSD helper, even though obviously the helper class name is just a helper. We can use this S keyword here to define them and use them as whatever name we want them to be. So Zend helper, for instance. And this way we know exactly which object. So if we created another object here, Zend helper, obviously this object would have to also be different here. And now we know exactly which helper we're referring to. So that's exactly what namespaces are. There's not much more into it. That's basically all there is. One thing to remember, PHP is using backslashes to basically point to the specific namespace, which is practically the divider. Before we had, for instance, SSD underscore helper, something like this. This is the old way of obviously dealing with the classes, but that obviously was creating pretty long classes if the file was deeply inside of the directory structure. So this is obviously helping also with the naming to make obviously names of the classes shorter. Because of this, we also have this inside of our load method, inside of the autoloader. We have this first condition here, which we haven't been using so far, because as you can see, we're using class name directly in the second statement. So obviously this one was always omitted, but now because we're going to be using namespaces, what we're going to do is use this variable, which obviously first filters for the namespacing, and then put it into the next statement to also filter by the underscore if there are any classes which are still using underscores. We're using two backslashes because if we use one, it simply escapes the single quote, so we need to use two of them. That indicates that we obviously replacing single backslash with the directory separator and obviously inside of the class name. This way we obviously produce the path to the specific file. Now inside of the require ones, we need to remove this classes path.ds because now we're going to add basically the path to the library folder into the include path, and this way we obviously can automatically point to the files inside of the relevant directory for specific library item.